By May 2026, conditions in the Persian Gulf were no longer defined by sudden escalation, but by slow, systemic accumulation. Shipping insurance had become strictly conditional, routing delays were entirely normalized, and competing naval presences from multiple external powers overlapped across the same narrow maritime geometry of the Strait of Hormuz. In Washington, President Donald Trump authorized what was publicly framed as a maritime security and escort initiative. But internally, the operational architecture was far more fragmented. Within the National Security Council, the Pentagon, and Central Command, there was no single unified definition of the mission. One interpretation treated it as deterrence signaling, another as trade corridor stabilization, a third viewed it as a vital restoration of U.S. credibility after prolonged regional ambiguity. This internal divergence mattered because the operation required flawless external synchronization to function as designed, and Iran's posture was already perfectly adapted to exploit that exact vulnerability. Tehran's Gulf strategy had long since evolved away from conventional blockade logic, relying instead on intermittent disruption cycles. By utilizing limited maritime interference, drone surveillance saturation, and selective signaling actions, Iran aimed to raise uncertainty without triggering a unified Western escalation. The objective was never the outright closure of the strait, but rather the systematic degradation of predictability across every commercial movement through it. In parallel, a second major constraint entered the system. Saudi Arabia, under Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, restricted the use of its airspace for offensive U.S. operations linked to the mission. While that decision did not terminate the operation outright, it permanently removed a foundational structural layer from the American security architecture. The American escort framework depended entirely on stacked redundancy, where air coverage, maritime surveillance, missile defense integration, and regional basing formed a single, integrated operational system, rather than a collection of separate capabilities. Because Saudi Arabia functioned as a critical structural node within that network, the architecture did not fail immediately once MBS imposed his restrictions. It simply degraded. First, CENTCOM's core routing assumptions broke, forcing air corridors to be rapidly recalculated. As a result, response latency increased across critical interception windows, and convoy predictability steadily declined under constantly shifting risk envelopes. Iran's approach amplified this architectural friction. Rather than engaging U.S. forces directly, Iranian elements operated through what planners internally described as controlled ambiguity, a pattern of intermittent interference designed to force a constant recalculation of threat probability. Consequently, every convoy movement became entirely conditional. Security was no longer a question of raw capability, but of systemic confidence, and confidence is not a resource that can be supplied by force alone. It depends on seamless, predictable coordination across all nodes in the system. By mid-2026, one of those vital nodes was now partially withdrawn. The Trump administration approached the Gulf operation primarily as a demonstration problem. A highly visible escort of commercial shipping under U.S. protection was expected to reinforce deterrence credibility, stabilize jittery global markets, and signal restored American dominance in vital maritime corridors. While President Donald Trump's personal framing emphasized rapid deployment and absolute decisiveness, the Pentagon's internal framework was vastly different, treating the operation as a risk-managed corridor stabilization exercise that was entirely dependent on layered regional support. These two interpretations coexisted within Washington, but they did not fully align. Meanwhile, in Riyadh, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was operating under an entirely different priority function. For Saudi planners, the strategic reference point was not maritime credibility, but infrastructure survivability under asymmetric escalation conditions. The 2019 Abqaiq strike remains the foundational structural memory inside Saudi planning logic. That event conclusively demonstrated that critical infrastructure could be successfully targeted despite the presence of a regional deterrence umbrella. By 2026, that lesson had been fully absorbed into the execution constraints of Vision 2030. The kingdom's massive economic transformation program depended strictly on three variables: capital inflow stability, a low perception of regional risk, and uninterrupted energy and logistics infrastructure function. From Riyadh's perspective, a high-visibility U.S. escort operation in contested waters dramatically increased the probability of Iranian retaliation against vulnerable Saudi infrastructure systems, specifically their desalination networks, export terminals, and energy distribution grids. Therefore, the restriction on offensive airspace was never a mere diplomatic gesture. It was a cold containment decision calculated inside a domestic transformation framework. Trump, however, interpreted the move through a completely different lens: the deliberate obstruction of operational execution. Neither interpretation accounted fully for the other side's real constraint environment. Once this operational constraint became visible, coordination shifted into rapid, multi-channel engagement, with direct communication between President Trump and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman becoming the central axis of negotiation. Their discussions were not rhetorical. They focused heavily on core system viability. While Washington emphasized maritime stability and global trade continuity, Riyadh remained hyper-focused on its exposure pathways and infrastructure vulnerability under escalation spillover conditions. Simultaneously, parallel institutional channels attempted to find a technical resolution. Defense planners explored phased access adjustments, intelligence channels focused on de-escalation framing, and military coordinators attempted to build rerouting models that could preserve at least partial escort functionality. Yet a fundamental structural constraint remained unchanged. Saudi Arabia's defense architecture is deeply integrated with U.S. systems, from missile defense networks and radar integration to long-term interceptor logistics. While this deep reliance created significant leverage inside the system for Washington, leverage does not simply override asymmetric risk perception when the actual exposure to danger is unevenly distributed. Over the course of 36 hours, the system failed to converge. Instead, it stabilized into a partial, uncomfortable accommodation. The escort operation was publicly described as paused pending diplomatic coordination, following direct engagement between Trump and MBS. Internally, however, the structure of the mission was permanently reduced. Escort density decreased, routing became less centralized, and overall operational visibility was lowered specifically to reduce exposure risk across all remaining nodes. The original configuration ceased to exist as a coherent system. The aftermath of the 36-hour window did not produce a sudden geopolitical rupture. Instead, it produced a permanent structural adjustment. Within U.S. defense planning, Gulf operations began shifting decisively toward distributed access models, moving away from a historical dependence on single-node regional basing. Within this new paradigm, operational redundancy was no longer an optional luxury. It became structural. This shift did not indicate an American withdrawal from the region, but rather a complete organizational redesign, with diplomatic engagement patterns increasingly routed through alternative Gulf partners to reduce single-point operational dependencies. In Riyadh, the adjustment followed a parallel defensive logic. Under MBS, Saudi Arabia actively expanded its external balancing framework. Economic and diplomatic engagement with China increased across infrastructure financing and industrial coordination channels, while simultaneously indirect deconfliction mechanisms with Iran were strengthened to reduce exposure to accidental escalation. These were not ideological alignment shifts. They were practical diversification mechanisms deployed within a highly constrained risk environment. Saudi Arabia was not exiting the U.S. security architecture entirely. It was simply repositioning itself within it as a conditional participant, rather than a structural assumption. The Gulf security architecture was historically built on a remarkably simple premise. External American protection guarantees internal Saudi stability in exchange for strict strategic alignment and energy predictability. For nearly a century, that model assumed stable automatic coordination between Washington's political commitments and Riyadh's operational access. The 36-hour breakdown between President Donald Trump and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman exposed the absolute limits of that assumption. It did so not through an explicit collapse of the alliance, but through the friction of competing constraints. The United States retains overwhelming military capability in the region, just as Saudi Arabia retains immense geographic leverage within operational planning structures. However, neither actor can anymore assume the automatic translation of intent into execution. What has emerged in its place is a system strictly defined by conditional cooperation under distributed risk. Trump's framework prioritized highly visible maritime enforcement to restore strategic credibility. MBS's framework prioritized economic transformation under asymmetric threat management. Both logics are internally coherent, but they no longer map cleanly onto a single, shared operational structure. The Gulf system is no longer governed by guaranteed alignment. It is governed by negotiated access under constraint. And that is the true structural shift. It is not the end of the partnership, but it is, definitively, the end of automaticity.